The night was quiet, the kind of calm that often settled over Ridgefield after the sun dipped below the horizon. Officer David Callahan sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos while scanning the empty stretch of Route 17. It wasn't unusual for him to be out here alone. Ridgefield was a small town where crime rarely reared its head. Most nights were filled with routine traffic stops, speeding teenagers, drivers with broken taillights, or the occasional DUI. But tonight felt different. There was an uneasiness in the air, a nagging feeling David couldn't quite shake off. David had been on the force for nearly 15 years. He was known for being fair, but firm, someone who genuinely cared about doing what was right. Over time, though he'd grown disillusioned, the system he once believed in seemed to be crumbling around him. Corruption had seeped into the cracks of Ridgefield's police department, and no matter how hard David tried to fight it, it always seemed like the bad guys got away. Still, he showed up every day, wearing his uniform with pride, determined to make a difference, even if it felt like he was shouting into the void. At around midnight, just as David was about to call it a night, his radar picked up a speeding vehicle barreling down Route 17. Squinting through the darkness, he saw the glow of headlights growing brighter. The car, a sleek black SUV, was moving at least 20 miles over the speed limit. Without hesitation, David flipped on his sirens and pulled out onto the road, positioning his patrol car behind the speeding vehicle until it came to an abrupt stop on the shoulder. David stepped out of his car, flashlight in hand, his boots crunching against the gravel. The driver's window rolled down slowly, revealing a man in his late 50s with sharp features and piercing eyes. His suit looked expensive, tailored perfectly to fit his frame. Something about him screamed authority, but there was also an air of arrogance that set David on edge. "License and registration, please," David said, keeping his tone polite yet professional. The man handed over his documents without argument, introducing himself as James Whitaker. "I'm sorry about the speed, officer," Whitaker said smoothly. "I'm trying to get back to Washington after a meeting, didn't mean to break any laws." David glanced at the ID. Sure enough, it identified Whitaker as the director of the FBI. David had seen enough badges in his career to know when something didn't feel right, and this one raised more questions than answers. For starters, why would the FBI director be driving himself late at night on a deserted highway? And why did Whitaker seem so eager to move past the traffic stop? As David examined the documents, he noticed subtle irregularities. The font on the license was slightly off, and the seal on the registration papers looked smudged, almost like it had been photocopied poorly. These weren't glaring mistakes, but they were enough to plant seeds of doubt in David's mind. He decided to dig deeper. "Where exactly are you headed, Mr. Whitaker?" David asked casually, leaning against the doorframe of the SUV. "Home," Whitaker replied curtly. "Like I said, I've got important matters to attend to." David nodded but pressed further. "Mind telling me what kind of meeting you were at?" Whitaker's expression hardened. "That's classified, officer. You understand." Instead of backing off, David leaned closer, shining his flashlight into the interior of the vehicle. That's when he caught a whiff of something metallic. Blood. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. His pulse quickened. What could possibly explain the smell of blood in a car driven by someone claiming to be the FBI director? Then, his gaze landed on the back seat. A dark duffel bag lay partially hidden beneath a blanket. Its zipper was slightly open, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a document folder. David's instincts screamed louder than ever. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. Whatever Whitaker was hiding, it wasn't good. David straightened up, his grip tightening on his flashlight. His training kicked in, reminding him to stay calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he said firmly. Whitaker frowned, clearly annoyed. "Officer, do you have any idea who I am? I don't think you want to escalate this situation unnecessarily." But David wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when everything inside him told him something was terribly wrong. "Please step out of the car, sir," he repeated. his voice, steady but commanding. For a moment neither man moved. The tension between them crackled like electricity in the cold night air. David knew he was taking a huge risk, but he couldn't ignore the warning bells ringing in his head. Little did he know, this decision would spiral into chaos and change his life forever. Officer David Callahan stood by the side of the road, his flashlight trained on James Whitaker, who remained seated in the black SUV. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching longer than the last. Whitaker's expression shifted, from irritation to thinly veiled anger as he realized David wasn't backing down. "You're making a serious mistake," Whitaker said, his voice low and clipped. "I'm not some common criminal for you to interrogate." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step back, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his service weapon. He wasn't trying to escalate the situation, but his instincts were screaming at him that something was off. Every detail, the smudged seal on the registration papers, the faint smell of blood, the mysterious duffel bag, pointed to trouble. And now Whitaker's refusal to cooperate only deepened David's suspicions. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," David repeated, his tone firmer this time. "We can resolve this quickly if you just comply." Whitaker's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed like he might argue further. But then, with exaggerated slowness, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door. As he stepped out, David noticed how Whitaker carried himself. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as though he wanted to emphasize his authority. He straightened his suit jacket and adjusted his tie, all while maintaining eye contact with David. It was clear Whitaker believed he was untouchable. "This is ridiculous," Whitaker muttered under his breath. "Do you even know what kind of pressure I'm under? People are counting on me to deliver critical information tonight." David raised an eyebrow. "What kind of information?" "That's none of your concern," Whitaker snapped. "Look, officer, I don't have time for this. If you want to write me a ticket, fine, but I'm not going to stand here and be treated like a suspect." David ignored the jab and gestured toward the SUV. "Mind explaining why there's a duffel bag in your back seat? What's inside?" Whitaker hesitated, his composure faltering for the first time. "It's personal belongings," he said quickly. "Nothing illegal." "Then you won't mind opening it up for me to take a look," David countered. The request seemed to catch Whitaker off guard. For a brief moment, panic flickered across his face before he masked it with indignation. "Absolutely not," he said sharply. "That bag contains sensitive material that isn't meant for prying eyes." David frowned. Sensitive material? From someone claiming to be the FBI director? It sounded plausible enough, but something about Whitaker's explanation felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared for this exact scenario. David's training told him not to trust appearances, especially when they came wrapped in polished excuses. "I'm sorry, sir," David said, his voice calm but unwavering. "If you refuse to show me the contents of the bag, I'll have no choice but to investigate further. You understand that standard procedure?" Whitaker crossed his arms over his chest, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Standard procedure? Officer, let me remind you who you're dealing with. I'm the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My work is vital to national security. Do you really think harassing me over a speeding ticket is worth jeopardizing that?" David didn't flinch. He'd heard similar threats before from people who thought their status made them above the law. But this wasn't about ego or power. It was about following protocol and listening to the nagging voice in his gut telling him something was wrong. "I respect your position, sir," David replied evenly. "But my job is to ensure public safety. If there's nothing incriminating in that bag, then proving it will clear things up right away. Otherwise," he let the sentence trail off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Whitaker glared at him, his earlier charm replaced by barely concealed hostility. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But if you so much as touch that bag without proper authorization, you'll regret it." David nodded and motioned for Whitaker to retrieve the bag. As Whitaker leaned into the SUV, David kept a close watch, his hand still resting near his holster. He couldn't shake the feeling that Whitaker might try something desperate. Sure enough, instead of grabbing the bag, Whitaker suddenly reached toward the passenger seat, muttering something about retrieving identification. In that split second, David's instincts kicked into overdrive. Was Whitaker reaching for a weapon? A decoy? Or was he genuinely trying to prove his identity? There was no way to know for sure, but David couldn't afford to take chances. Without hesitation, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Whitaker. "Stop moving," David barked, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Whitaker froze, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Whitaker slowly raised his hands, his face contorted with fury. "Are you insane?" he demanded. "You've just committed federal assault. You'll lose your badge for this." David ignored the threat, his focus razor-sharp. "I said keep your hands visible. Now step away from the vehicle." Whitaker complied reluctantly, his movements stiff and mechanical. Once he was clear of the SUV, David instructed him to place his hands on the hood of the car. The entire scene felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Here was David Callahan, a small-town cop, holding a high-ranking government official, at gunpoint on a deserted highway. Any passerby would think he'd lost his mind or worse. As David began frisking Whitaker for weapons, his mind raced. What had started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into a full-blown confrontation. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, one that could cost him everything. But he also knew he couldn't ignore the warning signs. Something about Whitaker didn't add up, and until David got answers, he wasn't letting his guard down. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens broke the silence. Backup had arrived, summoned by Whitaker's earlier calls for assistance. David watched as 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt behind his own, their headlights illuminating the tense standoff. Officers spilled out of the vehicles, guns drawn, shouting orders for David to lower his weapon. For a moment, David considered resisting. After all, he was convinced he was doing the right thing. But as the other officers surrounded him, their expressions unreadable, he realized the gravity of the situation. Whether he liked it or not, he was outnumbered, and the odds were stacked heavily against him. With a heavy sigh, David lowered his gun and stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. As one of the officers cuffed him, Whitaker straightened, up, brushing imaginary dust off his suit. "This isn't over," he said coldly, his eyes locked on David. "Mark my words, officer. You'll pay for this." David met Whitaker's gaze, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. Whatever consequences lay ahead, he knew he'd done what he believed was necessary. The question was, had he uncovered the truth or sealed his own fate? The scene on Route 17 was chaotic. Red and blue lights flashed across the dark highway, casting eerie shadows on the ground. David Callahan stood handcuffed between 2 officers, his hands secured behind his back, while James Whitaker paced nearby, adjusting his tie and smoothing out his suit jacket as if trying to reclaim some semblance of dignity. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief. What had started as a routine traffic stop had spiraled into something far more explosive, an armed standoff between a small-town cop and one of the most powerful men in the country. Whitaker wasted no time asserting his authority. As soon as he was free to move, he barked orders at the arriving officers, demanding they secure the area and confiscate David's weapon. "This man is unstable," Whitaker declared, pointing an accusatory finger at David. "He pulled a gun on me without provocation. I want him arrested immediately." David didn't resist as the cuffs tightened around his wrists. He knew arguing would only make things worse. Instead, he kept his gaze steady, watching Whitaker carefully. There was something almost theatrical about the way Whitaker carried himself now, his tone commanding, his gestures exaggerated, as though he were performing for an invisible audience. It struck David that this wasn't just about punishing him. It was about sending a message. Whitaker wanted everyone there to know who held the power. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, but followed Whitaker's instructions without question. They searched David's patrol car, seizing his service weapon and radio. One officer even went so far as to pat David down again, despite the fact that he was already cuffed. It felt like overkill, But David understood why. They were covering their bases, making sure nothing could be traced back to them later. Loyalty in law enforcement often came with strings attached, and tonight those strings were firmly tied to Whitaker. Meanwhile, the growing crowd of onlookers added another layer of complexity to the situation. A few cars had slowed down when they saw the commotion, their drivers pulling over to gawk or film the scene with their phones. Some shouted questions from afar. "What's going on? Why is that cop being arrested?" Others simply recorded silently, their cameras capturing every detail. David could feel their eyes on him, judging him, forming opinions based on what little they understood. He wondered how the footage would play out online once it hit social media. Would people see him as a hero standing up to corruption, or as a rogue cop who let his emotions get the better of him? As the minutes ticked by, Whitaker grew increasingly agitated. He spoke into his phone in hushed tones, pacing back and forth as he waited for higher-ups to arrive. Whatever he was saying, it wasn't meant for public ears. David strained to catch snippets of the conversation but couldn't make out much, beyond vague phrases like damage control and national security risk. Each word reinforced his belief that Whitaker was hiding something big, something worth risking everything for. Eventually, a black sedan pulled up behind the line of patrol cars, its engine purring softly as it came to a stop. Two men in dark suits stepped out, their expressions unreadable. They moved with purpose, exuding the kind of confidence that came from knowing they were untouchable. Without hesitation, they approached Whitaker, who greeted them with a curt nod before pulling them aside for a private discussion. David watched the trio intently, his mind racing. Who were these men? Federal agents? Political operatives? Whoever they were, their presence confirmed one thing. This wasn't just a local matter anymore. It had escalated into something much larger, something that reached far beyond Ridgefield. One of the suited men eventually turned his attention to David, studying him with cold, calculating eyes. For a moment, their gazes locked, and David felt a chill run down his spine. There was no warmth in the man's expression, no hint of empathy or curiosity, just a detached professionalism that made David feel like a specimen under a microscope. Then the man looked away, turning back to Whitaker and nodding slightly, as if giving approval for whatever plan they'd devised. The next hour passed in a blur. David was loaded into the back of a patrol car, his protests ignored as officers cited protocol and chain of command. Someone handed Whitaker a clipboard, which he signed with a flourish before climbing into his SUV and driving off into the night. The duffel bag remained untouched, still sitting on the back seat where David had first spotted it. No one opened it. No one questioned it. It was as though it didn't exist. Back at the station, the interrogation room became David's new reality. Stripped of his badge and gun, he sat alone at a metal table, staring at the walls as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. His mind replayed the events of the night over and over again, searching for any mistake he might have made. Had he misread Whitaker's intentions? Could he have handled the situation differently? The questions gnawed at him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd done the right thing, even if it cost him everything. Hours later, a stern-faced detective entered the room, carrying a thick file folder. He introduced himself as Agent Monroe, though his demeanor suggested he was anything but friendly. "Officer Callahan," Monroe began, setting the folder on the table with a thud. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" David met his gaze evenly. "I was doing my job," Monroe scoffed. "Your job? You pointed a loaded firearm at the director of the FBI during a routine traffic stop. That's not doing your job. That's reckless endangerment." "It wasn't reckless," David shot back, his voice firm despite the exhaustion creeping into his bones. There were inconsistencies in his story. Things didn't add up. And then there was the smell of blood in his car. Tell me that doesn't raise red flags. Monroe leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Listen carefully, Callahan. People like Mr. Whitaker operate on a level you can't even comprehend. You think pointing a gun at him makes you some kind of hero? All you've done is create a mess that none of us can clean up." David frowned. "So, What am I supposed to do? Ignore my instincts, pretend I didn't see anything suspicious? That's exactly what you're supposed to do, Monroe snapped. When someone like Whitaker tells you to stand down, you stand down. End of story. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. This wasn't justice, it was complicity. He realized then that the system he'd dedicated his life to serving wasn't broken, it was rigged. Men like Whitaker pulled the strings and everyone else danced along, too afraid to question the music. By dawn, the charges were filed: assault, misconduct, obstruction of justice. David's colleagues distanced themselves, offering weak excuses about following orders. Even Captain Lewis, who had once praised David for his integrity, avoided eye contact as he processed the paperwork. "It's out of my hands now," Lewis muttered, refusing to meet David's gaze. David didn't argue. He knew fighting back would only dig him deeper into a hole. Instead, he focused on staying calm, reminding himself that the truth mattered more than public opinion. Somewhere out there, answers waited to be uncovered. If he could hold on long enough, maybe someone would listen. But as the cell door clanged shut behind him, David couldn't help but wonder how many others had tried to expose the truth and failed. The fallout from that fateful night on Route 17 was swift and merciless. News of Officer David Callahan's arrest spread like wildfire, fueled by the videos captured by curious onlookers who had stopped to watch the standoff. By morning, the footage had gone viral, with headlines splashed across every major news outlet. Local cop arrested after pointing gun at FBI director. Rogue officer sparks national controversy. And was it justice or overreach? The public reaction was divided. Some hailed David as a brave whistleblower standing up to corruption, while others condemned him as an overzealous cop blinded by his own ego. For David, the days following his arrest felt surreal. He sat in a cold, sterile cell, staring at the gray walls as the world outside debated his fate. His badge and gun were gone, symbols of a career he'd poured his heart into, now reduced to ash. What hurt most wasn't the loss of his freedom, or even the accusations against him. It was the betrayal. The department he'd served for 15 years abandoned him without hesitation. His colleagues, once friendly faces in the break room, avoided eye contact when they passed by his holding cell. Even Captain Lewis, who used to call David one of his best officers, refused to visit. David tried to stay focused. He replayed the events of that night over and over in his mind, searching for answers. Had he misjudged James Whitaker? Could there have been another way to handle the situation? But no matter how many times he analyzed it, he kept coming back to the same conclusion. Something about Whitaker had been wrong. The irregularities in his documents, the smell of blood, the mysterious duffel bag, it all pointed to trouble. And yet, here David was, locked away, while Whitaker walked free. As the media circus intensified, Whitaker took center stage, portraying himself as the victim of an unstable officer's paranoia. In interviews, he spoke calmly and confidently, painting David as a loose cannon who had endangered national security. "I was simply trying to do my job," Whitaker told reporters during a press conference. "Officer Callahan's actions were reckless and unnecessary. This is why we need strict accountability within law enforcement." His words dripped with authority, and the crowd ate it up. To the average viewer, Whitaker came across as the embodiment of professionalism, a man wronged by circumstance. But not everyone bought the narrative. Investigative journalist Rachel Monroe saw through the polished veneer. A seasoned reporter known for exposing government scandals, Rachel had spent years digging into stories others deemed too risky. When she stumbled upon the video of the traffic stop, something about it caught her attention. Why would a decorated officer risk everything to confront someone like Whitaker unless he genuinely believed something was amiss? Intrigued, she began digging deeper. Rachel reached out to David shortly after his arrest, requesting an interview. At first, David hesitated. He didn't trust anyone anymore, not the system, not the media, not even himself. But Rachel's persistence paid off. She visited him in jail, sitting across from him in a cramped visiting room as she listened intently to his side of the story. David recounted every detail: the speeding SUV, The suspicious documents, the faint scent of blood, the duffel bag. Rachel scribbled notes furiously, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "You think Whitaker was involved in something illegal?" Rachel asked finally, leaning forward slightly. "I don't know what he was involved in," David admitted. "But I know something wasn't right. Those documents, the bag, whatever it was, it scared him." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "If you're telling the truth, then this goes way beyond Ridgefield. People like Whitaker don't operate alone. If there's dirt, it's buried deep. But it's there." Her confidence gave David a glimmer of hope. For the first time since his arrest, he felt like someone might actually believe him. Rachel promised to look into the matter further, vowing to uncover the truth no matter where it led. As she left the jail, David couldn't help but wonder if this was his last chance. If Rachel failed, he'd be stuck facing charges that could ruin his life forever. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against David moved forward with alarming speed. Prosecutors wasted no time filing formal charges, portraying him as a rogue officer who had violated protocol and endangered lives. The trial date was set for 6 weeks later, leaving David little time to prepare a defense. His court-appointed attorney, a young lawyer named Marcus Hale, seemed competent enough but lacked experience with high-profile cases. Still, Marcus promised to do everything he could to help David fight the charges. "This isn't going to be easy," Marcus warned, during one of their meetings. "They've got witnesses, evidence, and Whitaker himself ready to testify. We'll need something solid to counteract that." David sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand. But what can I give you? My gut feeling? That's not exactly admissible in court." Marcus leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. "We need more than just your instincts. If we're going to win this, we need proof, something concrete that shows Whitaker was hiding something." Proof. The word echoed in David's mind long after Marcus left. Proof was exactly what he didn't have. Without access to Whitaker's SUV or the duffel bag, there was no way to verify his suspicions. All he had was his word, and in a courtroom that wouldn't be enough. Back in the real world, Rachel Monroe worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. She started by reviewing Whitaker's background, combing through public records and leaked documents. What she found was startling. Whitaker's name appeared in connection with several high-profile corruption scandals involving government contractors. Rumors swirled about kickbacks, embezzlement, and classified operations gone awry. While none of it amounted to hard evidence, it painted a troubling picture of a man whose hands weren't nearly as clean as he claimed. Rachel also managed to track down surveillance footage from a gas station near the warehouse Whitaker had visited earlier that evening. The timestamp matched the timeline of events leading up to the traffic stop. In the grainy video, Whitaker could be seen pacing nervously outside the building, occasionally glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone or something to appear. Moments later, a second vehicle pulled up, and 2 men unloaded, a large duffel bag identical to the one David had spotted in Whitaker's SUV. The discovery sent chills down Rachel's spine. Whatever Whitaker had been transporting, it hadn't come from nowhere. Someone else was involved, and judging by the secrecy surrounding the exchange, it wasn't anything legal. Despite her progress, Rachel knew she needed more. She reached out to confidential sources within the FBI, hoping to find whistleblowers willing to speak out against Whitaker. It was a dangerous game. Leaking classified information carried severe consequences. But eventually, one source agreed to meet her, under strict conditions. They provided Rachel with damning evidence linking Whitaker to a covert operation involving stolen documents tied to national security breaches. According to the source, Whitaker had been using his position to cover up illegal activities, ensuring those responsible remained untouchable. Armed with this new information, Rachel published an exposé that rocked the nation. Her article detailed Whitaker's alleged involvement in corruption, presenting both circumstantial and direct evidence to support her claims. The piece went viral overnight, sparking outrage among readers and prompting calls for accountability. Congress launched an investigation into Whitaker's activities, forcing him to step down temporarily as FBI director. Public pressure mounted, with protests erupting outside federal buildings demanding transparency. For David, the developments offered a sliver of vindication, but it came too late. By the time Rachel's expose hit the presses, David had already been convicted of assault and misconduct. The jury, swayed by Whitaker's testimony and the prosecution's portrayal of David as a reckless officer, handed down a 5-year prison sentence. As the judge read the verdict, David sat silently, his face impassive but his heart heavy with disappointment. Still, even in defeat, David refused to give up. From behind bars, he continued fighting for justice, working with Rachel to expose the full extent of Whitaker's crimes. Though the road ahead would be long and grueling, David held on to one unshakable belief: the truth always finds its way to the light, even if it takes a little longer than expected. Behind the cold gray walls of Ridgefield Correctional Facility, David Callahan's days blurred together in a monotonous haze. The clanging of metal doors, the chatter of inmates, and the distant hum of fluorescent lights became the soundtrack to his new reality. Yet despite the bleakness of his surroundings, David refused to let despair consume him. Every morning he woke with a purpose: to clear his name and expose the truth about James Whitaker. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Prison wasn't exactly the ideal place for investigative work. But David had never been one to back down from a challenge. Rachel Monroe became his lifeline during those long months. She visited him regularly, bringing updates on her investigation and sharing snippets of information she'd uncovered. Each visit reignited David's determination, reminding him that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Rachel's expose had already sent shockwaves through the political landscape, but she warned David that Whitaker wasn't going down without a fight. Powerful people were rallying around him, spinning narratives to protect their interests. For every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. Whitaker's lawyers are working overtime, Rachel told David during one of their meetings. They're trying to discredit my sources and bury the evidence before it gains traction. But we're not giving up. David nodded, his jaw tightening. We can't afford to. If we stop now, everything I've lost will have been for nothing. Rachel leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. I found something else. A surveillance log from the night of your traffic stop. It shows Whitaker visiting that warehouse just hours before you pulled him over. And guess what? The same warehouse has ties to a company implicated in several government corruption scandals. Her words sparked a flicker of hope in David's chest. Finally, they had tangible proof connecting Whitaker to suspicious activity. But as much as David wanted to celebrate, he knew the road ahead was fraught with obstacles. Evidence could be dismissed, witnesses silenced, and investigations buried under layers of bureaucracy. Still, he held on to the belief that justice, though delayed, would eventually prevail. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, public opinion began to shift. Rachel's expose had ignited a firestorm of debate, with citizens demanding answers. Advocacy groups rallied behind David, framing him as a whistleblower who had sacrificed everything to expose corruption. Petitions calling for his release gained thousands of signatures, and protests erupted in major cities across the country. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Free David Callahan and Our Truth Over Power, keeping the story alive in the national consciousness. Even some of David's former colleagues started speaking out, albeit cautiously. Captain Lewis, once reluctant to defend David, quietly admitted to reporters that David had always been a stickler for rules and integrity. He might have crossed a line, Lewis said carefully, but I don't think he acted out of malice. Something about that night didn't sit right with him, and maybe we should have listened. The growing support gave David strength, but it also put pressure on him to stay strong. Letters poured into the prison from strangers thanking him for standing up to power, urging him not to lose faith. One letter, written by a young woman named Emily, stood out. You remind me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, she wrote. But someone has to do it. So thank you for being brave when no one else would. David kept the letter tucked inside his uniform, reading it whenever doubt crept in. It reminded him why he'd taken the risk in the first place, not for fame or recognition, but because he believed in justice. Back in Washington, the pressure mounted on Whitaker. The congressional investigation into his activities expanded, uncovering more connections between him and shady government contractors. Emails leaked to Rachel revealed secret meetings, hush money payments, and plans to suppress evidence. One document in particular caught everyone's attention: a memo outlining a covert operation involving stolen classified documents. According to the memo, Whitaker had personally authorized the transport of these documents to secure locations, though the exact nature of those locations remained unclear. The revelations forced Whitaker to resign from his position as FBI director. In a terse statement, he claimed he was stepping aside to focus on clearing my name, and accused Rachel of orchestrating a smear campaign. But the damage was done. His credibility crumbled under the weight of mounting allegations, and allies who had once defended him began distancing themselves. Even members of Congress, eager to avoid association with scandal, called for transparency and accountability. As the tide turned against Whitaker, David's case gained renewed attention. Legal experts argued that his conviction should be overturned, based on newly discovered evidence proving his suspicions correct. A team of pro bono attorneys joined Marcus Hale in filing an appeal, citing prosecutorial misconduct and insufficient evidence at trial. They argued that David had acted reasonably given the circumstances and that withholding critical information about Whitaker's background had deprived him of a fair hearing. The appeals process dragged on, testing David's patience and resolve. There were moments when he doubted whether justice would ever come. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if the system was too broken to fix, left him restless. But then he'd remember the faces of those who supported him. The protesters, holding signs, the strangers sending letters, the whistleblowers risking their careers to speak out. Their courage inspired him to keep pushing forward. Finally, after nearly 2 years behind bars, the court granted David a retrial. This time, the proceedings unfolded differently. Armed with Rachel's findings and testimony from whistleblowers, David's defense team painted a compelling picture of a man who had acted on instinct and integrity rather than recklessness. Witnesses described Whitaker's involvement in corrupt practices, while forensic experts confirmed the authenticity of the leaked documents. Even some jurors admitted later that they felt sympathy for David, seeing him as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. In the end, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. As the judge read the decision, David sat motionless, barely daring to believe it. When the gavel struck the bench, signaling the conclusion of the trial, tears welled up in his eyes. He hadn't cried since the night of his arrest, but now, overwhelmed by emotion, he allowed himself a moment of release. Outside the courthouse, supporters erupted in cheers. Cameras flashed as David emerged, flanked by Rachel and Marcus. Reporters shouted questions, but David simply raised a hand in gratitude, his expression a mix of relief and resolve. He didn't say much that day, knowing his actions spoke louder than words. Instead, he focused on the future, a future where he could continue fighting for justice even if it meant standing alone again. For David, freedom tasted bittersweet. While he was grateful to reclaim his life, he couldn't forget the sacrifices made along the way. 2 years of his life had been stolen, and scars, both visible and invisible, remained. But he vowed to use his experience as fuel for change. Corruption thrived in silence, and David was determined to ensure that silence never won. As he walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by friends and supporters, David felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. After all, he'd learned something invaluable during his darkest days. Sometimes standing up for what's right means losing everything and gaining even more in return. David Callahan stepped out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, blinking against the glare as cheers erupted around him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of chains, both literal and metaphorical, lift from his shoulders. The crowd of supporters who had gathered outside chanted his name, holding signs that read, "Truth prevails," and "Justice for David." Reporters jostled for position, microphones thrust forward, eager to capture his reaction. But David didn't speak. Instead, he raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement, his face etched with gratitude but also a deep weariness that only those who'd fought long battles could understand. The victory was bittersweet. Yes, he was free. And yes, the truth about James. Whitaker's corruption had finally come to light. But at what cost? 2 years of his life spent behind bars, relationships strained or severed entirely, and a career in law enforcement reduced to rubble. David knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could shape the future, and he vowed to do so by continuing the fight against corruption, no matter how daunting the odds. In the weeks following his release, David became something of a reluctant celebrity. Invitations poured in, from talk shows, advocacy groups, and community organizations, all eager to hear his story. At first, David hesitated. He wasn't comfortable being thrust into the spotlight, especially after years of isolation. But Rachel Monroe encouraged him to use his platform wisely. "People are listening now," she told him during one of their frequent meetings. "You have a chance to spark real change. Don't waste it." So David began speaking out, sharing his experience not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a cautionary lesson about the dangers of unchecked power. He traveled across the country, addressing crowds large and small, urging them to question authority and demand accountability. His speeches were raw and unpolished, filled with emotion rather than rehearsed rhetoric. And while some critics dismissed him as bitter or self-serving, most audiences connected with his authenticity. Here was a man who had risked everything, not for glory, but because he believed in doing what was right. One of David's first stops was Ridgefield itself, the town where it all began. Returning there was harder than he expected. Memories lingered on every street corner, reminders of a life he once knew. Many of his former colleagues avoided him, still wary of associating with someone labeled a troublemaker. But others welcomed him back warmly, apologizing for their silence during his darkest days. Captain Lewis even offered him his old job back, though David politely declined. "I can't go back to the way things were," he explained. "Too much has changed for me and hopefully for the system." Instead, David partnered with Rachel to launch an initiative aimed at promoting transparency within law enforcement and government agencies. Dubbed the Callahan Accountability Project, the organization provided resources and support to whistleblowers, trained officers on ethical decision-making, and advocated for policy reforms. It was a daunting task, requiring endless hours of work and navigating political minefields, but David found purpose in it. Every email from someone seeking help, every success story of corruption exposed, fueled his determination to keep going. Meanwhile, the fallout from Whitaker's downfall continued to ripple through Washington. Investigations expanded beyond Whitaker himself, uncovering a web of corruption involving high-ranking officials, contractors, and lobbyists. Several arrests were made, and numerous policies were overhauled to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. While Whitaker managed to avoid criminal charges due to lack of direct evidence tying him to illegal activities, his reputation lay in ruins. Once hailed as a pillar of integrity, he was now a pariah, shunned by former allies and mocked in the press. For David, seeing justice served, even imperfectly, was vindication enough. Still, he refused to rest on his laurels. Corruption, he knew, was like a weed. Cut it down in one place and it sprouted somewhere else. The fight would never truly end, but that didn't discourage him. If anything, it motivated him to dig deeper, push harder, and shine a brighter light into the shadows. As months turned into years, David settled into a new rhythm. He rented a modest apartment in Ridgefield, close enough to stay involved in the community but far enough to maintain a sense of privacy. He spent his days working on the Callahan Accountability Project, mentoring young officers, and occasionally consulting with journalists investigating government misconduct. Nights were quieter, filled with reflection and planning for the next steps. Though scars remained, emotional and otherwise, he carried them as badges of honor, reminders of the battles he'd fought and won. Rachel remained a steadfast ally, her friendship evolving into something deeper over time. They shared a bond forged in adversity, united by their commitment to exposing the truth. Together, They celebrated victories big and small, knowing each step forward mattered. "We're rewriting the rules," Rachel said one evening as they sat on David's porch watching the sunset. "Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after." David smiled faintly, nodding. "It's not about rewriting the rules," he replied. "It's about making sure people follow them in the first place." His words stayed with Rachel long after the conversation ended, a testament to the philosophy that guided David's actions. He wasn't interested in revenge or accolades. He simply wanted to leave the world better than he'd found it. And though the journey had been grueling, he believed, with every fiber of his being, that it was worth it. Years later, when historians looked back on the scandal that rocked Ridgefield and Washington, David Callahan's name became synonymous with courage and integrity. Textbooks mentioned him alongside other whistleblowers who had dared to challenge the status quo. Documentaries chronicled his story, highlighting the moment when a small-town cop stood up to one of the most powerful men in the country, and won. But for David, the legacy wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the knowledge that he had stayed true to himself, even when the world seemed determined to break him. As he often said during his speeches, "Standing up for what's right doesn't make you a hero. It makes you human." And, if we all did our part, no matter how small, imagine the world we could create. David didn't need statues or monuments to validate his choices. His reward was simpler, the satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference. And as he stood on his porch one final evening, gazing at the stars, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The road ahead would always be uncertain, but for now, he was content. After all, he had done what he set out to do: expose the truth, inspire others, and prove that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's voice could still change the world.